I suspect that there could be many references to past episodes in this conversation, or even to future episodes. But in my last conversation with Shelley, I mentioned a conversation prior to that conversation with David Albert, in which David said that for much of the last 100 years, the metaphysics of quantum mechanics has been held back by Bohr's legacy and the Copenhagen interpretation, but that David's work and your work, Tim, and Shelley and Barry Lowers and Nino Zangi's and so on has really undermined this. And now there are other interpretations on the table. But Shelley said that he still thought Copenhagen was dominant or might be dominant, not just among physicists, but among philosophers. And so, Tim, I wanted to check with you to see if you still think that's the case. And Shelley, if you think,
I'm not so sure about philosophers.
Okay.
Yeah,
Tim certainly know better about philosophers.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, first of all, let me just say it was a very lovely list of people, but, again, it was really Bell, I think, who sparked proper, rigorous discussion of these issues and kind of blew away a lot of the rhetorical clouds that had been standing in people's ways of clearly understanding what the issues were. And we, to a large extent, were picking up from him. Yeah, so there's a sociological question. I think it's quite true. I think it, quite honestly, would be hard to find philosophers of physics who are out defending something they would call the Copenhagen interpretation or out defending Bohr. I mean, there's a few people nowadays who are kind of in a sort of retro way going back to try to rehabilitate Bohr. But I would say the overall sense is that you can map out different approaches and Copenhagen isn't among them just because it's not clear. I mean, the one thing as a philosopher you want is clarity of even what you're talking about. And with Bohr, as Shelley said, you just don't have that. So I don't think there are many philosophers of physics who would step up and say they're Bohrian. There's a little bit of this epistemic stuff that floats around that, among the physicists goes under the name cubism and some certain kind of pragmatic strands that show up here and there. But I think probably most philosophers of physics are on the same page about what the options are that are in a situation to be worthy of serious discussion at this point. As for physicists, I think they're happy to have some words they can say and then try and change the subject. I will mention one data point, which is that Adam Becker, when he wrote his book fairly recently, What is Real, and he has a physics background, and he gave a lot of talks in physics departments, and he was expecting very strong pushback against criticisms of Copenhagen, and he said he didn't get it. He said when he criticized Copenhagen in front of physics departments, he got a lot of nodding heads of people saying, yeah, we never understood it either. Not, yes, this is the key, to understanding everything. So that's not from me, but from him. He was expecting much more pushback and it didn't come.
David mentioned that some of Bohr's papers were so unclear and unreadable that for years a couple of pages were transposed or one was missing or something like this and no one noticed.
They're switched, yeah, in the big red volume in whatever it's called, Quantum Measurement, and I don't know, the Zurich volume that reprints all these papers.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really suggests a lack of clarity if that wasn't totally obvious. Then this begs the historical and sociological question of why Bohr had such an impact on discussions and the practice for so long before Bell, as you mentioned, was the main person who dispelled this.
Look, we're now in historical territory. I don't feel at all as secure about. But unlike David tends to read Bohr as just an instrumentalist. I don't. I read Bohr as somebody who grew up steeped in neo-Kantianism. I think, I mean, there are things that he says that, to me, if he was raised with a bunch of Kantians around talking about what it is and is not anschaulich, that makes a lot of sense out of some of the things he writes. And tell me why Kant has been so popular, right? I mean, in philosophy, why has Kant had such a huge impact when he's pretty incomprehensible? I mean, nobody thinks you can just sit down and read the critique and understand what's going on in it. But nonetheless, he's had this huge impact in philosophy that continues to go on, partly because of the obscurity. There's a certain level of obscurity and Gnostic pronouncements that come across to people as deep and profound, which I'm not built that way myself, but, lots of people are. We certainly know in philosophy, lots of people are.
Robinson, have you read Bohr's writings?
I have not.
It's worth making an effort just to get a good sense of how incoherent they tend to be. And this raises the question, number one, why did physicists themselves, who are very smart people, not provide a sharp critique of what Bohr wrote? And it raises certainly the question of why philosophers who are supposed to be in that business tended early on to rarely give a sharp critique of what Bohr wrote. There was a failure in both communities, I believe. The only person that I'm aware who actually bothered to give a sharp critique, and it was devastating, it was basically 1 or 2 paragraphs of Bohr, was John Bell. But the literature should have been full of stuff like that, because Bohr was such an inviting target in this respect.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of, granted, as you pointed out, I haven't read it, but it still sort of reminds me of the Sokol hoax, which I talked about with your colleague Tim Paul Boghossian, but essentially this nonsense paper was accepted by some prestigious postmodernist journal, and nobody batted an eye. But it's interesting that ostensibly nonsense thought could become dogma in a field like physics, where nonsense is anathema.
Yeah, I mean, there may be a historical, let me give a piece of what may be the correct historical account. Again, I'm not confident about this. The development of quantum mechanics goes through a bunch of different phases, and a lot of people go back to Planck. But when you read Planck, it's clear he didn't really know what he was doing. I mean, he found a mathematical technique that got him the answers he wanted, and he didn't even have any clear view about why it worked or what it suggested about the physical world that it worked. And then in 1905, Einstein, ironically, given how much he really disliked what happened with quantum mechanics, I think really kicks the thing off with his paper on the photoelectric effect. But David often talks about this other problem about the stability of matter, because just naively using Maxwellian electrodynamics, you would expect that if the electrons were orbiting the way we draw pictures of them orbiting, they should radiate out energy and crash into the nucleus. Now, there was something called the old quantum theory. So this is in the teens, that Bohr came up with, which were just a bunch of numerical rules for allowable orbits that you could kind of motivate as not being unreasonable, but didn't have anything deep underneath them. So Bohr says, well, what if the orbits have to be confined to this discrete set of orbits, and electrons can only jump between them, and they have different energies, and when they jump, they emit or absorb only the amount of energy that's the gap between the two. Okay, so that's the old quantum theory. That's a kind of relatively clear sketch of a picture, but it immediately raises the question, but when and why and how do the electrons jump from one orbit to another? right? I mean, then that's just a good physical question. How does it go from orbiting this way to orbiting this way, right? What's the transition like? And so they kind of beavered away at that for a while, but they couldn't make any progress on it. And then the new quantum theory basically comes with giving up on questions like that. Just, we're not going to ask them. They're no longer legitimate questions. Now, if you've been banging your head against a question for a while and not making any progress, you're in a good psychological state to be receptive to someone saying, that's not a good question, right? Stop trying to answer it. And then what does Bohr back that up with? Well, all the stuff about what is and is not unschaulich, which goes back to, what you can visualize. And we've reached the end of visualization. And the only reason that you're looking for these exact trajectories is that you're thinking that things are visualizable when they're not. But Kant told us that visualizability has to do with human sensibility, blah, blah, blah. So I think you could tell a story where people would welcome the obscurity because it was an escape from a bunch of technical problems that they didn't know how to solve and got them out of them, right? Not by solving them, but by telling you a little fairy story so you didn't have to solve them. I mean, there's this famous quote by Einstein. Shelley wrote that, read that other quote on your interview with him. There's a famous quote in a letter much later, I don't know, maybe in the 40s, when he talks about how all the physicists are asleep. They've been lulled away on this pillow of quantum philosophy. I don't know the exact quotes. And it's better just let them sleep. We can't wake them up. And I think he had his finger right on the thing. People didn't want to talk about this stuff because they didn't know what to do with it. And they were kind of getting along without it. And they just don't rock the boat, right?
But there was maybe it was the authority of Bohr somehow which scared people from talking about this stuff. I don't think the physicists in the street would have been quite so intimidated were it not for the authority of the leaders, Bohr, maybe Heisenberg. What was going on between those two is not so clear. A lot of competition, an unhealthy situation, no doubt. Einstein and Schrodinger never bought for a second any of the Bohr nonsense, but not for a second. But for some reason, people tended to not side with Einstein or Schrodinger, but Bohr for reasons I can't really understand, but I can emotionally feel because I myself, knowing so little, felt I wanted to side with Bohr. That was not because I knew so much, because I knew so little. Maybe if you knew enough, you'd have the confidence to know you shouldn't be siding with. I wanted quantum mechanics to be the revolutionary thing we were being told it was. I really wanted that to be the case. I'm not proud of that, but that's how I felt. And I suspect that's how many physics students and physicists ended up feeling. Bohr, by the way, did get the Nobel Prize for that Bohr model, and it was a great achievement. And it somehow points to the subtlety and the difficulty in physics, where you can be doing something which clearly is in many respects inadequate, and yet is an important step on the road to the truth, which that model was. Of course, it can lead to wrong conclusions, as Tim said. Nonetheless, how does one tell in physics what kind of inadequate things is still something to be taken very seriously, and what kind of inadequate thing should be dismissed out of hand? It's not always an easy judgment.
Yeah.
So Tim described my list as lovely, but that list, it included the two of you, Barry, David, Nino Zangi, some other people, but you all agreed that the Copenhagen interpretation was unclear. And I'm wondering now, before we get to your divergences and intuitions, because, for instance, the two of you and David and Barry have very different approaches to and beliefs about the theories of quantum mechanics. But what was Bell's, since you said he was the main person, was there one clear intuition or problem he had with Bohr's work that motivated him to try to move beyond it?
Yeah, it didn't make any sense to him.
Okay.
really was. It really wasn't subtle. If you read Bohr, you just see how incoherent it is. The surprising thing is not that a smart guy like Bell couldn't stomach such nonsense. The surprising thing is that so many other people tolerated it. Smart people.
Yeah, I mean, you should also. I mean, ironically, Bell also says some nice things about Bohr. At a certain point, about the necessity of describing the experimental situation in, quote, classical terms, by which one doesn't mean classical dynamics, but it does mean essentially, macroscopic bodies with certain characteristics in normal space-time, right? That you sort of needed to be able to do that, which he appreciated that Bohr said that. But I mean, the thing that, the two things that strike you about Bell are, first of all, he's just incredibly clear. I mean, you can't read anything he writes if you read it with attention and not really understand what he's saying. He's very sharp. And that's in contrast to trying to force your way through page after page of Bohr and just feeling at sea, like you don't know where you are, you don't know what's happening, you don't understand the structure of the arguments, you're just kind of, drowning. And I think one of the things that helped me was there's an appendix to one of the papers where Bell talks about Bohr's response to the EPR paper, and he just says, I can't understand it, right? I mean, I just can't follow what he's saying. And he gives quotes and says, I don't understand what this means. And that just, it makes you feel good, right? You think, oh, Bell is a really smart guy. If he couldn't follow this, then the fact that I can't follow it may not be a problem with me, right? It's a problem with the text.
Yeah. But
gives you some courage.
He couldn't understand it. He said he couldn't understand it, but then he gave a devastating critique of it.
That's true.